Nothing smells quite like burning rubber, except maybe burning revenge. And at 6:00 a.m. on a quiet March morning in 2025, Jake Parker wasn't expecting either, just the bitter promise of coffee as he stumbled out of bed, groggy and half awake, until an acrid stench sliced through his haze like a slap. He lurched to the window, heart plummeting as thick black smoke curled into the sky. And when he bolted outside, barefoot and frantic, the toxic reek of charred metal and gasoline flooded his lungs. There, in his driveway, his 1967 Mustang, a cherry-red masterpiece he'd spent years restoring, roared with flames, the heat a suffocating wall that turned his skin clammy despite the dawn chill. His neighbors gathered, their murmurs a dull buzz he barely registered, his world shrinking to the inferno devouring his pride. Every painstaking hour under the hood, every scraped knuckle, every dime he'd poured into it. Gone. And then, like a cruel twist of fate, a nasal voice pierced the chaos. Well, 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 looks like you should have followed HOA regulations. And Jake spun, fists clenched, to face Karen Whitmore. She stood on her pristine lawn across the street, arms crossed over her cardigan, the self-appointed HOA queen who'd hounded him since day one. Her smug face devoid of concern, just radiating that self-righteous glow she wielded like a scepter, watching his life burn with the satisfaction of a petty dictator. Jake's voice cut sharper than he meant. You think this is funny? And Karen sighed, patronizing as ever. I warned you, Jake, that car was an eyesore. HOA guidelines state vehicles older than 10 years belong in a garage. If you'd listened, this wouldn't have happened. Her words dripping with audacity that made his head spin. His Mustang wasn't some junk heap, it was a collector's gem, yet she'd nagged him relentlessly, first with snide remarks about aesthetic standards, then fines piling up in his mailbox because he wouldn't hide it away. Are you seriously implying this is my fault? He demanded, voice trembling with rage or disbelief. He couldn't tell. And Karen shrugged, exaggerated and dismissive. I'm just saying accidents happen. As sirens wailed closer, a fire truck screeching onto the street. Firefighters leaping out to battle the blaze, but Jake knew it was too late, the Mustang a lost cause, years of passion reduced to ash before his eyes. Helplessness sank into his chest, heavy and choking, as a burly firefighter approached, soot-streaked and grim. Any idea how this started? Jake swallowed hard, glancing at Karen's eerie calm. Not yet, but I've got a feeling it wasn't an accident. And the firefighter nodded, exchanging a look with his crew. We'll check for anything suspicious, before turning to sift through the wreckage. Jake's gut screamed Karen was involved. Her composure, her satisfaction, it didn't add up. But suspicion wasn't proof, and without evidence she'd slither away unscathed, her HOA crown intact. Then he noticed old man Jenkins on his porch, arms crossed, the block's unofficial watchdog who saw everything, and their eyes locked. Jenkins gave a knowing nod before slipping inside, sparking a flicker of hope in Jake's chest. If anyone had seen something, it was him. Karen sighed loudly. Quite the spectacle, but I hope you take this as a lesson in compliance, Jake, and his blood boiled. Get off my property, he snapped. She smirked but didn't argue, sauntering away, leaving him staring at the smoldering ruin, mind racing. She'd pushed him too far, and if she thought this was over, she was dead wrong. He'd find out what happened, and someone was going to pay. The next day, Jake stood in his driveway, the acrid sting of burnt metal and rubber still hanging in the air, staring at the melted husk of his Mustang. More than a car, it was a testament to years of late nights, busted knuckles, and every spare dollar he'd scraped together, now reduced to a twisted graveyard of memories that churned his stomach with grief and fury. Anger burned hotter than the flames ever had, a resolve hardening in his chest. He wasn't letting this slide, not with Karen's smug face seared into his mind. And he knew he needed a lawyer, not some pushover, but a shark who'd shred her HOA tyranny without blinking. After hours of digging online, he found Lucy Carter, a name whispered in HOA horror stories. A relentless litigator who tore through neighborhood regulations like tissue paper. And when he walked into her cluttered office, she sized him up with a piercing stare, barely letting him get 3 words out before smirking. You pissed off an HOA, Karen? Congrats, you've joined a club bigger than you'd think. What's the damage, and how much do you want her to pay? Jake didn't hesitate. 100 grand at least, and Lucy whistled, leaning back. Now we're talking. What proof you got she torched your car? His jaw tightened. Nothing solid yet, But she clicked her pen, unfazed. Doesn't matter. We don't need her holding the match, just a hand in it. Fines, threats, harassment history, give me something. He dumped a stack of letters on her desk. Months of Karen's fines for parking his Mustang in his own driveway, each one escalating from snide to menacing, the latest warning of consequences if he didn't comply. Lucy flipped through them, eyebrow arched. Oh, this is good. Threats, excessive fines, then a fire. That's a pattern juries eat up. HOA villains are their favorite. It sparked a sliver of hope, but Jake knew he needed more. And that's when Jenkins flashed in his mind, the old man's knowing look and that doorbell camera. If it caught anything, it could tip the scales, so he headed straight to Jenkins' house, knocking hard on the creaky door. It cracked open, one squinting eye peering out. Took you long enough. I wondered when you'd ask. Jenkins muttered, swinging it wider, his place reeking of old books and coffee, a crime show droning on low as he shuffled to his laptop. Didn't see her light it, but she was lurking by your car right before it went up. Thought it was odd. Figured you'd want this. He turned the screen and Jake's pulse spiked. Grainy footage showed Karen packing near his driveway past midnight, glancing around nervously, then pulling something small from her purse, bending near the front tire. Minutes later, she walked off, and though it wasn't a smoking gun, it was damn close. Proof she'd been there tampering right before the blaze. Jake rushed the video to Lucy, whose face lit up like a kid on Christmas. This is it. Proves she was there, and with the threats and fines, its motive, we're filing today. And as she typed up the lawsuit, Jake felt the first real surge of control since the fire. He had Karen in his sights now, her smugness about to crack. Days later, instead of folding, she doubled down. An HOA letter hit his mailbox, fining him for damaging neighborhood property due to negligence. Claiming the fire hurt the community's image, and Jake's blood boiled anew. She wasn't just unrepentant. She was taunting him, but this time he had the upper hand, and the war was officially on. Jake clutched the HOA's latest letter, the ink practically dripping with Karen's gall, fining him for the fire she'd likely started, blaming his negligence for tainting the neighborhood's precious image. And his fury propelled him straight to her doorstep. The paper crumpled in his fist as he pounded on her door, ready to shove her hypocrisy down her throat. She opened it with that infuriating smirk, a steaming teacup in hand like she'd been expecting him, cooing, "Ah, Jake, I heard you got my letter. Such a shame about your car, but the HOA had to act. A fire on your property affects our safety and aesthetic." Her voice syrupy with fake concern as she sipped her tea, daring him to snap. "You're fining me for the fire you started." He growled, stepping closer, and she gasped, hand to chest like he'd insulted her honor. "That's a terrible accusation, completely baseless." But he wasn't buying her act, lowering his voice. "I've got footage of you near my car minutes before it went up, plus every letter proving you threatened me for months." For a split second, her mask slipped. Arrogance flickered into something unsteady. But she recovered fast, smoothing her expression. "If you had an ounce of proof I did anything, you'd be at the police, not here, so unless you've got something solid, pay the fine like a responsible homeowner." And Jake's jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. She was calling his bluff, but Lucy's lawsuit was already in motion, a guillotine she didn't see coming. He stormed home, adrenaline pumping, and called Lucy, who laughed when he recounted the encounter. "She's digging her own grave. Keep that letter. It's more ammo." And Jake felt the tide shifting, Karen's taunts only fueling the case barreling toward her like a freight train. The court date loomed fast, and when it arrived, Jake sat beside Lucy in the plaintiff's section, nerves buzzing but confidence growing as he watched Karen across the room. Beige suit crisp, self-righteousness oozing, her stiff lawyer at her side looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The judge entered, proceedings kicked off, and Karen's lawyer went first, spinning a tale of Jake as a reckless homeowner, his hazardous, Mustang an accident waiting to happen, the fire a tragic but inevitable fluke. Jake bit back a scoff, letting Lucy take the reins as she stood, her presence sharp and predatory, laying out every threat, every fine, every complaint Karen had lobbed at him over months, her voice slicing through the room. "This isn't just HOA overreach. It's harassment with a body count. My client's car didn't spontaneously combust. It was targeted." She played Jenkins' footage, the grainy image of Karen lurking by the Mustang freezing on the screen, her fingers tightening on her lawyer's arm as Lucy turned to the judge. Your Honor, this proves she was there, and with her documented vendetta, it's a clear motive. Mr. Parker deserves every penny of the $100,000 we're seeking. Karen shifted, lips thinning, her composure cracking as the video looped. Her packing, her bending by the tire, her skulking away. And Jake savored it, her smugness wilting under the weight of evidence she couldn't dodge. Then out of nowhere, a voice broke the tension. An HOA board member stood from the audience, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, I have something to add. And the room hushed, Karen's head snapping toward him, eyes narrowing. Jake leaned forward, pulse spiking, sensing a curveball that could either clinch it or blow it wide open, and Lucy's grin hinted she smelled blood. The courtroom fell silent as the HOA board member stepped forward, his unexpected interruption hanging like a thunderclap. Karen stiffened, her beige suit suddenly looking less like armor and more like a costume, her hands folding tightly in her lap as Jake watched, barely breathing, every nerve on edge. The judge nodded. Proceed, mister. And the man cleared his throat, voice shaky but resolute. Robert Langley, Your Honor. I've been on the HOA board for 3 years, and I have information relevant to this case. His eyes darting to Karen, who glared back with a ferocity that could have melted steel. But he didn't waver, pressing on. I have emails from Karen, sent to the board, discussing ways to force Mr. Parker out of the neighborhood. She wanted him gone because of his car, and when fines didn't work, she suggested more creative solutions. A murmur rippled through the room, Karen bolting upright, face crimson. This is outrageous. He's lying. I never said that. She snapped, but Robert didn't flinch, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a thick stack of printed emails. These came from her official HOA account. I printed them when I heard about this lawsuit because I knew something wasn't right. And Lucy stepped forward, snatching the papers with a triumphant smirk, flipping through them as she addressed the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit these into evidence. The judge took the stack, his face unreadable as he skimmed the pages, while Karen's lawyer whispered furiously in her ear. She ignored him, her gaze locked on Robert, radiating betrayal and rage, but Jake caught the flicker of panic beneath it. She hadn't seen this coming, and it was unraveling her fast. Lucy leaned over to Jake, muttering, This is gold, she's toast. And as the judge reviewed the emails, the tension thickened. Karen's own words, typed in black and white, laid bare her vendetta. Suggestions to make an example of Jake, hints at escalating measures. And one damning line, if he won't move, we'll make it impossible for him to stay. The judge looked up, voice flat. These emails paint a different picture from what Ms. Whitmore claims. It's clear there was an ongoing effort to target Mr. Parker, and given the footage, the fines, and this testimony, I find sufficient merit to rule in favor of the plaintiff. And Jake's breath caught as he continued. Mr. Parker, you're awarded full damages, $100,000, the words hitting like a sledgehammer. He'd won after the fire, the threats, the sleepless nights. Justice had landed square in his lap. Karen shot to her feet, shrill and unhinged. This is absurd. I demand an appeal. This case is a farce. But the judge's glare silenced her. Ms. Whitmore, sit down before I hold you in contempt. And she sank back, eyes blazing, her rein slipping through her fingers as Jake smirked. She'd finally lost. Court adjourned, and Lucy clapped Jake on the back, grinning. Told you we'd get her. HOA dictators always think they're untouchable, but she picked the wrong car guy. And Jake shook his head, still reeling. I can't believe she thought she'd get away with it. The victory sinking in as they stepped outside. The weight of $100,000 and Karen's downfall a surreal balm to the Mustang's ashes. He glanced back one last time. Karen storming out, lawyer trailing her like a scolded dog, and felt the first real peace since the fire. She wasn't done fighting, but her claws were clipped, and Jake had the upper hand now, ready to watch her empire crumble. Jake walked out of the courthouse, the $100,000 verdict buzzing in his head like a victory anthem, the weight of Karen's defeat lifting a burden he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying since the fire. Lucy's confident stride beside him felt like a shield, her words still ringing. She picked the wrong car guy? And he couldn't help but grin, the taste of justice sharper than any coffee he'd craved that fateful morning. The air felt lighter, the neighborhood's quiet streets waiting for him to reclaim them, but Karen's shrill outburst, her demand for an appeal, echoed in his mind. She wasn't done clawing, even with her throne cracking, and Jake knew her pride would keep her swinging, though now it was just noise against the judge's gavel. Back home, he stood in his driveway, the Mustang's charred skeleton still haunting the concrete. But the wind dulled the sting. He'd lost a car, sure, but he'd gained something bigger. Proof that her HOA tyranny couldn't bury him, and as he kicked a stray bolt aside, he felt the fight shift from survival to savoring her downfall. A few days later, whispers hit the block. Karen was out as HOA president, the board finally fed up with her power trips after the lawsuit splashed across local news. Her reign of petty fines and smug lectures officially dead, and Jake couldn't suppress a laugh. She'd built her kingdom on sand, and he'd washed it away with one well-aimed wave. Then the real kicker landed. Robert, the board member who'd flipped on her, called Jake, voice brimming with glee. "You're gonna love this. Karen's selling her house. Can't afford to stay with your lawsuit payout and the HOA digging into her past stunts. She listed it yesterday." And Jake nearly dropped his phone, the image of her smug face packing boxes too sweet to process. "No way," he said, leaning back in his chair, grinning wide. "Guess she finally learned actions have consequences." And Robert chuckled. "About time, neighborhood's better off without her." Hanging up as Jake let the news sink in, Karen, the woman who'd torched his life over a car, now torching her own by losing everything. He pictured her manicured lawn, that pristine fortress of HOA dominance, slapped with a "for sale" sign, her cardigan-clad reign reduced to a moving truck's cargo, and it felt like poetic payback. Better than any revenge he could have dreamed up, served cold by the law and her own board's betrayal. The next week he drove by in his new Mustang. Not the '67, but a damn fine replacement, its engine purring as he rolled past her house. The sign glaring in the sun, and there she was, stepping out with a cardboard box, her eyes locking with his across the street. She froze, tight-lipped, no snide quips or lectures this time. Just a flicker of defeat as she hurried past, head lower than he'd ever seen, and Jake couldn't resist, rolling down his window. "Tough break, Karen," his voice low and taunting. She didn't respond, just kept walking, the box wobbling in her arms, and he laughed, pulling away with $100,000 in his pocket and satisfaction burning brighter than the fire she'd set. The neighborhood felt free, her shadow lifting with every step she took toward exile, and Jake gripped the wheel, the Mustang's roar a middle finger to her legacy. He'd won, not just the case, but the war, and damn, it felt good to drive away a victor. Jake cruised through Oakwood Hills in his new Mustang, the engine's growl a steady pulse beneath him, each turn of the wheel a reminder of the $100,000 victory and Karen's fall. Her "for sale" sign still lingered in his mind's eye, a trophy of her defeat, and the neighborhood's air felt cleaner without her hovering like a vulture over every driveway. The news of her HOA ousting had spread fast, neighbors swapping stories of her reign with a mix of relief and disbelief. Old fines for lawn ornaments or unapproved. Paint colors suddenly seemed laughable now that her clipboard tyranny was history. And Jake caught nods and waves from folks who'd once kept their heads down, a quiet acknowledgement that he'd sparked the uprising. He didn't need their thanks. The Mustang's leather seats and the hum of freedom were enough, but the shift was palpable. Kids played in yards unbothered by noise violations. Porches sported quirky chairs she'd defined into oblivion, and Jake smirked, knowing her aesthetic obsession had been torched alongside his old car. Even Jenkins, the gruff watchdog, tipped his cap from his porch one day, muttering, "Good riddance to her camera. Off now, no need to spy anymore." And Jake chuckled, the old man's footage the linchpin that cracked her armor wide open. A week later, Lucy called, her voice sharp with amusement. Heard Karen's appeal got laughed out of court. Judge didn't even let her lawyer finish. She's officially done, and the HOA's rewriting every rule she touched. And Jake leaned against his kitchen counter, grinning. "Couldn't have done it without you. She thought she'd bury me, but you buried her." Lucy laughed. "She's a textbook case. HOA types always overreach. You just gave me the shovel." And as they hung up, Jake felt the final threads of the fight unravel. Her appeal dead, her house on the market, her power stripped, all because she'd underestimated a guy who loved his car more than her rules. He stepped outside, the Mustang gleaming in the driveway, no longer a target but a symbol. Karen's eyesore had outlasted her, and the irony wasn't lost on him. She'd burned his passion to ashes, only to watch him rise with a better ride and her own exile as the payoff. Driving past her place again, he saw movers hauling out furniture, her once pristine lawn scuffed and chaotic. And though she wasn't there, the scene was victory enough. Her kingdom dismantled piece by piece, just like his Mustang had been, but this time he was the one left standing. The neighborhood settled into a rhythm Karen would have hated. Messy, alive, human. No more letters about compliance. No fines for living. And Jake felt the weight of her shadow lift fully, replaced by a quiet pride that he'd not just survived her war but ended it. He pulled into his driveway, the Mustang's engine cutting off with a satisfied purr, and stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the spot where the fire had raged. It was just concrete now, no wreckage, no scars, a blank slate he'd reclaimed, and it hit him. He turned her revenge into his redemption. The battle had cost him a car, sure, but it had won him peace, a fat check, and a story nobody on the block would forget. Karen was gone, and Jake was still here, driving proof that her rules couldn't outlast his fight. Jake leaned against his new Mustang, parked proudly in the driveway where its predecessor had burned, the late March sun glinting off the hood as he watched the neighborhood hum with a life Karen's rules had once strangled. Kids darted between yards, their shouts unchecked by noise ordinance threats, and a neighbor 2 doors down mowed his lawn in flip-flops, a sight that would have sent her into a fine-writing frenzy. The HOA's overhaul was in full swing, her draconian bylaws scrapped for simple guidelines that didn't treat homeowners like criminals, and Jake felt a quiet thrill knowing his lawsuit had lit the fuse. Robert's emails, Jenkins' footage, Lucy's courtroom shredding had toppled her empire, and now the block was free to breathe, to be messy and real again. He'd heard through the grapevine that her house sale was stalling, buyers spooked by the lawsuit headlines, and he couldn't help but smirk. She'd torched his Mustang to teach him a lesson, only to learn the hard way that petty revenge didn't pay when you messed with someone who fought back. The $100,000 sat in his account, a war chest he hadn't touched yet, though the Mustang's purr was a damn fine start, and every time he drove it, he felt her defeat rumble through the engine, a middle finger to her smug lectures about community standards. One afternoon, old man Jenkins shuffled over, coffee mug in hand, his usual gruffness softened by a rare grin. Saw her realtor out there yesterday, looked like he'd rather sell a haunted house than hers. Words out she's toxic. And Jake laughed, leaning on the car. Couldn't happen to a nicer tyrant. Thanks for that footage, by the way, tipped the whole thing. Jenkins shrugged, sipping his coffee. Had to, her lurking around your place at midnight was too damn weird. Figured she was up to no good. And as he ambled back to his porch, Jake replayed that night in his mind. Karen's shadowy figure, her nervous glances, the small object by the tire. Still no proof she'd lit the match, but enough to bury her in court, and that was victory enough. Later, he met Lucy for a beer at a local dive, her eyes glinting as she slid a news clipping across the table. Karen's HOA scandals had sparked a state review of neighborhood boards. You didn't just win, Jake. You started a reckoning. She's the poster child for overreach now. And he clinked his bottle against hers. Good. Let her name be a warning label. The thought of her legacy as a cautionary tale sweeter than the payout itself. Driving home, Jake passed her house again. The for sale sign tilted slightly grass-patchy, a far cry from her manicured perfection, and he felt the fight's last embers cool. She'd tried to burn him out, but he'd turned the flames back on her, and now she was the one running. The Mustang's wheel felt solid in his hands, the neighborhood's pulse alive around him. No more fines, no more threats, just people living. And he pulled into his driveway, cutting the engine, the silence a testament to her absence. He'd lost a car, sure, but gained a home. A win, a story etched into Oakwood Hills. Bones. Karen was a ghost now, and Jake was the guy who'd banished her. The Mustang his proof that passion outlasts pettiness every time. Jake stood on his porch, the early April breeze carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass instead of burning rubber. His new Mustang gleaming in the driveway like a phoenix risen from the ashes of Karen's spite. Oakwood Hills had shed her shadow, and he felt it in the air, a neighborhood unshackled, alive with laughter and the clatter of kids' bikes. Her house sat empty now, the for sale sign finally gone after weeks of stalling, Word was she'd taken a steep loss, fleeing to some condo across town, her HOA crown stripped and her name a punchline in local papers. And Jake couldn't suppress a grin, the $100,000 in his bank a quiet hum of victory, though the real prize was this. Driving his classic without her fines, her threats, her smug face looming over his every move. He'd heard the state's HOA review was tightening rules because of her, boards scrambling to avoid their own Karen Whitmore moment. And Lucy had texted him a laughing emoji with, "You're a legend now, car guy who took down the tyrant." But Jake didn't need the title. The Mustang's purr and the block's peace were his medals, hard-won and sweeter than any courtroom speech. He leaned on the railing, replaying her last walk past him. Box in arms, no snide quips, just defeat. And it hit him. She'd burned his passion to cinders, but he'd burned her kingdom to the ground, and damn, it felt good to be the last one standing. One evening, Jenkins hobbled over, his usual grumble replaced by a rare chuckle. Saw her realtor griping at the bar, said she left half her junk behind. Guess she couldn't face packing it all. And Jake smirked. Figures, she always did half-ass her exits. The old man nodding as he shuffled off, leaving Jake to savor the image of Karen's pristine life in disarray, her cardigan-clad reign reduced to clutter in an empty house. The neighborhood kept healing. New faces on the HOA board ditched her petty fines, redirecting funds to fix sidewalks instead of policing mailboxes. And Jake caught neighbors grinning at his Mustang now, not whispering about violations. A shift from pariah to quiet hero he hadn't sought but didn't mind. He took a drive that night, the Mustang's engine a steady roar through streets once ruled by her clipboard, and as he passed her old place, dark, sold, someone else's now, he let out a low whistle, the same taunt he'd tossed her way, "Tough break, Karen." The words lost to the wind, but heavy with the weight of her fall. She'd messed with the wrong guy, and he'd made sure she'd never forget it. Pulling back into his driveway, Jake cut the engine, the silence wrapping around him like a victory lap. No smoke, no sirens, just home. And he stepped out, hands in his pockets, the concrete clean of wreckage, a slate wiped by his fight. The Mustang wasn't his 67, but it was close, a new chapter bought with her defeat, and as he looked out at the block, free, messy, alive, he felt the war's end settle in his bones. She'd tried to break him, but he'd broken her instead with $100,000, a car, and a story that outlast her HOA legacy. Jake turned inside, the door clicking shut, and smiled. Karen was gone, the neighborhood was his again, and behind the wheel or on his porch, he was finally, truly home.